the Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello, welcome back to the show. And today I welcome back once again. Guess who's back? Back again. Emma's back. Emma.
Hi, Rebecca. How are you?
Dr. Emma, I'm so happy to have you back on the show again.
Oh, I love being here. Dr. Emma is happy too. And I love the topic we're gonna talk about today. So I'm excited for this episode.
Yeah, this is a topic that I feel like we've just dabbled into in a few episodes that you've been on. And in the last episode, I mentioned how this is a topic that you keep bringing up that I know nothing about. So today we are going to talk about Mr. Fun Guy, Sir Henry Guildford.
Yay! My friend's finally gonna get some attention. I love it. I love it. I've been with this guy for a long time, studying him, wanting to hang out with him because we'll talk about how fun he was, the things he did. He was amazing. And it's nice to also talk about the guys. You know, there was some amazing guys in the court of Henry VIII. So this Sir Henry Guildford is one of them. He was fun guy. He was a lot of things, not just fun guy, but mainly fun guy.
Every time I say fun guy, I don't know if you ever watched Friends. It reminds me of Fun Bobby. I don't know if you remember
watched Friends. I can't believe I don't remember Bobby.
Yeah,
Who's Bobby?
Fun Bobby, if I remember, was Monica's boyfriend, but he was an alcoholic. And everybody called him Fun Bobby, and then he got sober and he wasn't fun anymore.
Oh my God, that's right. Yes, I remember. Yeah, that happens to some people.
It does. It does. But good for him for getting sober, right?
Good for him. Good for Fun Bobby.
So let's talk about Fun Henry instead. Why don't we kind of start out? Why don't you give us a little bit of background about him to kind of set the pace, or set the tone for today?
Okay, so today, because this is not my field of expertise, I have a little cheat sheet here. Anytime that you guys want to learn about people in the Tudor court, I recommend the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, because you always know that that's a place where those articles, biographical articles, have been written by academics, so they are pretty accurate, and that's where you can pull information it's just difficult. Also, for more updated information, Melita Thomas just published a book on all the Tudor, the court, the name. So there's different sources. I always go to the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, and Sir Henry Guildford was the son of Richard Guildford, Sir Richard Guildford, by his second marriage to Joan, the sister of Saint Nicholas Vaux, the first Baron Vaux. Well, the names in English is so difficult when you don't know them. But what I want to talk about his childhood is we don't know a lot of it, but we do know he was born in 1489. So he is between the ages of between Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII. Catherine of Aragon was born in 85, Henry VIII in 91. So he's a couple years older than Henry VIII and kind of grows up with him. And when Henry becomes king, Sir Henry Guildford becomes someone very prominent in his court, especially because he is the party guy. He organizes the revels and the parties.
It's interesting because when we hear about friends at court of Henry VIII, the first one that we always think of is Charles Brandon, right?
Right. I wonder why, though. Is it because we like Charles Brandon? Because we like certain show that Charles Brandon?
Are we going to start talking about Henry Cavill again?
Maybe. He's in the news today, so maybe.
If only the real Charles Brandon looked like Henry Cavill.
That's the only way he looks in my mind. So,
right.
No, but you're right. But Suffolk is a very important person later in the reign of Henry VIII, especially during the divorce proceedings. And that's why I think he becomes a relevant person. Henry sends him to Catherine to tell her the news, to a lot of things. So he marries the king's sister. He becomes relevant because of that. But Sir Henry Guildford had always been part of his group of friends too, when he first became king. And he was a couple years older than him. And then, because he's friends with the king, he starts doing amazing things. And for example, he goes to Spain and fights with Ferdinand of Aragon and is knighted in Burgos because of his contributions to the war of all the uprisings again in Granada and all that area. And he's granted a pomegranate in his coat of arms. So he's linked to Catherine of Aragon by those things of service to her father, right? So he's also linked to the Spanish monarchy. And then when he comes back to England after that, he obviously, the young king, is super proud of him and also gives him more and more offices and more places in his court. And he just becomes someone really relevant. And because he's the party guy, and because the first years of the reign of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon were a continuous party, like an ambassador described, a very, very continuous party, they did extraordinary things. Like, for example, very shortly after a couple years into their marriage, they were dressed as they did a little secret surprise to Catherine of Aragon. They dressed as the Robin Hood, as Robin Hood and all the characters in that tale, and they surprised the Queen, and they did a little performance, and the King was one of them. So Sir Henry Guildford was always there to provide we think about parties like, oh, it's a lot of fun, but they are at the core of artistic innovation, and that's why I started studying them so much. So, for example, imagine all the new garments that you need if you're going to introduce something like the carnival, which becomes very relevant during this time, the first years of Henry VIII, because it's a very Hispanic feast that becomes relevant. And in the first year, they dressed as Turks because Catherine has brought a lot of those garments that resemble the fashion of the Ottoman Empire, and so it's just as, and this there's also a lot of innovation in terms of a lot of influence from her Flemish side. So there's a lot, the women receive a lot of new garments in the Flemish style. There's a revolution in the fashion with these feasts and these festivals that become so relevant in the first years of the reign of Henry VIII. She brings such a big dowry, and Sir Henry Guildford uses those everything that she brought to make these parties. So he's the one, for example, to organize when little Henry, the ninth was born in 1511. He's the one to organize the Epiphany in the Queen's chamber, and it's the first time that terracotta is used to make pomegranates. So we have accounts of molds of pomegranates for terracotta. This is a new medium. This is a new way of producing art in England, because it was Italian sculptor Pietro Torrigiano who introduced terracotta. To what this is telling us is that the partnership between Sir Henry Guildford and Catherine of Aragon brought artists to England like Pietro Torrigiano and later on Hans Holbein the Younger. So this is how relevant organizing the parties is.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And I think it's so easy for us to forget that Katherine of Aragon came over here with her own cultural influences, and that they were actually enacted at Tudor court, that it wasn't just all English stuff all the time. She brought her own stuff along and influenced the court as well.
So she not only brought a lot of material culture with her because of her huge dowry and her own private collection of stuff that her mother over the years gave her. We know that she had painting, she had tapestry, she had, with the story of Alexander from antiquity, she brought the biggest dowry in late medieval history to England, and that transformed the fashion in the Tudor court, jewelry. Those big chains that we see in the court of Henry VIII, those are influenced by the big chains that were created for Catherine's dowry when she came to England. We have to think this is what she brought. I studied this dowry for my master's dissertation, and it was Queen Isabella was paying for 2 to 5 years for this humongous dowry, because a great big part of it was in jewels and plate. And also, she had to be fully serviced to be Princess of Wales and eventually Queen of England, bringing her own stuff too, bringing her own chapel, bringing her own, all of this, all of these objects and ideas, because she was raised in that way that we've been talking about, that Renaissance new way for women in Spain. there's a revolution in the Tudor court when this dowry becomes part of the royal collection, Henry's royal collection, right? And in return, Henry gives her the biggest endowment, jointer, ever, because he has to reciprocate that. So she's the richest queen of England in many respects. In I don't know, in history, I would have to reflect on this, but probably.
I think we always hear about how when Henry VIII came to the throne, his father had left him all this money in the coffers, that we don't hear that Catherine had so much money that she brought. It always seems like Henry had all the money. He wanted to have all the fun, but she brought some too. That's interesting to see that side.
She brought a lot of money, tons and tons of money, jewels, plate. I mean, it was in England for all the time that Catherine was there, but it was in the possession of her camarero, her in her household, because it was her dowry until she was married. So until she marries him, and the documents are there where she as soon as Henry VII dies, some of the first documents are Catherine giving to Henry her dower and him accepting it as her husband. So and then everything that she owned that she had brought from Spain goes into the royal household. She receives these castles and residences and places from Henry, and that's where she puts her stuff, right? So Baynard's castle was the one that she received in London, the main one. And this was near Blackfriars. This was in the heart of the Thames too. It had one of the only workable ports, Queenhithe. So this was a crucial place for her to control, especially, for example, during her regency in 1513. And so what I'm saying is that all this stuff that she brought and all the money she receives because she brought all this stuff makes her very powerful immediately. Then we have to remember that in 1509, Henry is 17 and Catherine is 24, and she's a full-on diplomat, ambassadress. And she has the key to Ferdinand of Aragon, not Henry. She's the one that has the key to her father. She's the one. Ambassadors bring letters credential letters to the king and to the queen too. For the first 6 years and later on the Spanish monarchy always. She was the one that was dealing with all the Spanish affairs and by extension with the Habsburgs. Yeah. And Sir Henry Guildford is someone that goes to serve Ferdinand to have stronger bonds because, for example, he's a keeper of Leeds Castle in Kent that had belonged to someone like Eleanor of Castile that we talked about in the previous episode. So these are all connections between courtiers of the court of Henry VIII and the Spanish alliance. So Henry Guildford is crucial for this.
So clearly she appreciated him as much as Henry VIII did.
Yes. And yes. And because he was Henry's friend, and she was very smart, she also wanted him close. And because he was in charge of all these rebels and things, she had the international contacts to bring all the information that Henry wanted. Henry had been brought up to be a Renaissance prince, Henry VIII. He was a Renaissance prince, and he wanted the best and only the best. And Catherine helped him, and Henry Guildford had those contacts. I mean, he had been knighted by Ferdinand in Burgos. He had seen the architectonical, for example, revolution in Burgos that was happening with these big chapels full of heraldry that are magnificent in the late Gothic style. He had seen the things in Granada. He had been, and Henry Guildford went to Holy Land too. This is a traveled guy. So she likes him because she had a book on the traveling to Holy Land. So Catherine of Aragon, that was an idea for her, for any Christian person. That was an idea of a pilgrimage to Holy Land was like amazing. So she would have talked to him about these things. She would have been so proud of him when he went to fight for her dad in Spain.
Yeah.
Imagine, you're going to like that guy. Of course you're going to like him.
and then he brings back all these fun things to do at court. And, you mentioned carnivals. Like I want to know
dances. So he introduces Moorish dances. So the influence of Islam in Hispanic culture at this time is amazing and great. So things when we see, for example, the Holbein portraits, and Sir Henry Guildford is painted, and his wife are painted by Holbein. When we see, for example, these Turkish carpets, these are coming from the Spanish monarchy. They're not coming directly from Turkey. There is evidence that that Cardinal Wolsey mentions once that he's waiting for all these carpets for Charles V to send him all these carpets that he wants from in the Turkish style. So this is what the Spanish monarchy is providing. The Spanish monarchy is providing magnificence to the Tudor court like never before. This opulence that we see in the Tudor court in the time of Henry VIII has come from the exchanges with the Spanish monarchy, mainly.
Wow.
Through Katherine of Aragon, obviously.
Oh, so, wow. Yeah. I feel like there's so much to this that it's a side of Tudor court that we don't hear about very often.
I'm going to quote Melanie Taylor here. Art historians know. Maria Hayward knows. She's written about this. She studies dress and fashion in the Tudor court. She's pointed out how Spanish fashion was essential to Catherine of Aragon to assert her power, and how it influenced the dresses in England. I think it's still not widely known, maybe, but it's definitely something that I think there's already works that have pointed it out. It's just a matter of for it becoming more mainstream to understand that, for example, the Renaissance doesn't come into England always from Italy and France. It also comes from Spain.
Yeah.
And sometimes the art of Italy comes, and mainly like someone like Beto Torrigiano, who's an Italian, but he has worked for Spanish patrons in Italy. Well, Beto Torrigiano, who works with Sir Henry Guildford in that first, he's the one to carve the tombs of Henry VII, Elizabeth of York, and Margaret Beaufort. That is done in the reign of Henry VIII, when he's only like a teenager, and Catherine of Aragon is mainly ruling for him.
Yeah.
So then this revolution in the sculpture, it doesn't. After him, there's nothing like it, and this is the reason why. Is because, but they're doing the same thing for the tomb of Catherine's sister in Avila. So there's an Italian artist, Domenico Fancelli, who is commissioned to do a tomb that's very similar to the one of Henry VIII and Elizabeth of York by Ferdinand. And now that I think of it, it's just after Henry VIII has been with him. Sir Henry Guildford, sorry.
Interesting.
Yes. There's more contact with the Spanish court at this time it's especially this part of Henry VIII's reign is very understudied, the first 5 years. And they're crucial because when he becomes an international figure, and it's when Catherine of Aragon basically rules for him until Wolsey takes over. There's a lot more that needs to be said about this time, because this is when the Tudor court really gets transformed into a Renaissance court. And they built an armada to be able to fight in Europe for this war that Catherine has gotten Henry into with the League of Cambrai to fight in France. That's why he captures Terouanne and Tournai in 1513, fighting with Maximilian, the emperor.
Yeah, that's an interesting part of history too. We always
European history. Exactly.
Yeah, we always just think, well, Henry wanted to beat the French, or he wanted to be a French king, but there's more to it than what we originally or initially see.
He calls Ferdinand of Aragon my father. He considers Ferdinand of Aragon the guy he's looking up to, and Ferdinand of Aragon is in the climax of his power. He conquers Navarre in 1512 in a mission that the English troops failed to provide the support that they were going to do. They all got drunk. I can't blame them. A lot of pressure at wartime, right? But the following year is when Henry's like, okay, I'm going to France and I'll fight with the emperor, and they capture those two cities, right, in the north of France. But what happens is that back home, And actually, Sir Henry Guildford is in Tournai when Henry VIII captures it. He goes to France with him.
And that was
But
in 1513, right?
Exactly. But what happens that year is that a certain Catherine of Aragon beats Henry VIII and doesn't conquer Scotland because Henry says no, but basically, the Scots invade, and there's it's just outstanding the way Catherine of Aragon handles it. You can tell she is a military leader, just a leader, and people are. I think that's when she gains that love, eternal love that the English subjects had for her, because she saved them from being, from invasion. That was a very serious thing that happened. Could have ended up very badly for Catherine of Aragon, who was heavily pregnant.
Right. And then she ended up losing that child too, right?
Right.
Yeah.
She did.
It's fascinating to me that Henry goes to France and he's fighting over there for his glory. He just wants this for himself, and Catherine's back in England and, leading the way to kill the King of Scotland. And she does this great thing, and Henry wins in France and his wife's back home. And she could have united England and Scotland in that moment. And yet, let's say maybe Henry's ego may have gotten in the way a little bit.
You're very right. There's a letter that not a lot of people know that she wrote was intercepted by the Italians going to it was translated into Italian. I think into Italian, yes. That she writes. This is in this letter, for all that I've said, that she was a nice person and she had a calm demeanor, not in wartime. She was ruthless, she was bloodthirsty, and it's almost like you're reading it and you're like, whoa, this woman is dangerous. She tells Henry basically, but I see the gravity of the situation. So the King of Scotland invades because he's an ally of the King of France. And it's not just a terrestrial invasion through the border. It's also there's ships, the ships that the French send to the Scots. This is a full-on European war, and one of the battlefields is England and Scotland, but not just territorially. It's just in the sea around them too. This is a total war in Europe. So Catherine is just doing what she needs to do. She's been left as regent, and the King of Scotland has dared to cross the border saying he's going to invade England. That's a declaration of war. She riles the troops, and she even threatens the places where they haven't done this. She's like, I'm not going to send another order. The next thing is going to be something else. It's going to be treason. And she writes a letter to Henry saying when she knows that the king has died, and she tells him, for example, that one English woman captured 3 Scotsmen. I've told you about this before. I thought that was excellent. She tells him, I will do the same for you that my father did for my sister last year. So Ferdinand of Aragon conquered Navarre, but it was added to the kingdom of his daughter, who was already imprisoned, Queen Juana, first of Castile. So he conquered Navarre for Castile, and that's what Catherine tells Henry. I will conquer Scotland for you, because we have to kill each and every one of these allies of the most treacherous king of France. She hates the King of France above all people, and it's an ally that is doing damage to her when she's left regent, and she has the heir to the English throne in her belly.
Right.
So I think because of the trauma of war when she was a child, because she grew up, in wartime, I think that kicked in, and it was just like the best way to defend yourself is the best possible attack. And we can do it because we're England. And she also does a very, very good speech to the troops. She's wearing she has a special crown made for her. She wears a full-on armor, and she rallies the troops, and she talks to them. And the person who mentions this was her former teacher, says, he's telling it to his pupil, like, look at this woman, what she did. She was my student. And now in the imitation of her mother Isabel, she talked to the troops and she said things to them like, the English bravery is the best in the world, and God smiles to us who are doing His will. So she really gives a speech that this guy says fires the troops. So
Yeah.
she's a military leader, and people respect her because she's gotten them into the war too. I think she feels that pressure. She's negotiated this. So she's like, it's my time to shine, and I'll show to Henry what I can do. And she does it to protect her child, obviously, and the Tudors, really. I mean, Henry should have done a bit more of a fuss that she did that, really, shouldn't he? But he couldn't take it.
Right. He couldn't. It makes me wonder. I think it was Thomas Howard, the second Duke of Norfolk, who was by her side during all of this, what he thought of her, because I'm sure he hadn't seen anything like that before, especially with like Elizabeth of York. She always seems so much more docile by comparison.
I'm sure Margaret Beaufort had a reputation of advising the king on difficult times. I'm sure that before the battle and all those things, he was with his mom. So I think there was precedence of strong females in the inception of the Tudor dynasty with Margaret, because she's really a survivor from the War of Roses, isn't she?
Yeah, she is.
And I think that idea of that permanent war was what united really Catherine with her subjects, her military subjects, like these guys, like Norfolk, because she came from a war zone too, and from a similar dynastic problem, and yet her mother had come above all that and ruled and had become, and everybody knew about Isabella of Castile and her ability to become a protective figure, especially when pregnant during wartime.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's the promise of if you win this, I'm bringing the most powerful monarch, because she was married to Ferdinand of Aragon. I think people saw Henry and Catherine a lot like they saw They're the New Ferdinand and Isabella.
That's fascinating. I've never thought of it that way before, but that's a good point.
Oh yeah, and I'm sure Henry wanted that. Doesn't want to be like And for Henry, it must have been so exotic to hear about his mother and father-in-law all the time, to exchange letters. Oh, by the way, this is really funny. So, Henry VIII writes a letter to Ferdinand of Aragon, and he's basically just like, "I love you so much. You're like a father to me. I'm obsessed with you." And Ferdinand writes back to Catherine, and he's like, "Do you mind if I just you and I don't need him to write me letters. I can tell you what I need to do."
Can we just keep your husband out of this?
Yeah. Can you just, doesn't he have a joust to be at?
Right. So now I have to bring up the moniker for Henry VIII that we discussed after the
Oh,
show,
yes.
after the last show, because you were talking about, how we have these guys that are named, of course, the handsome and the wise and the bold and all of that. So I think Henry VIII should be Henry the Tool.
Henry the Tool. Everybody uses him.
Right. So he was such a tool. He really was.
He was. I mean, I'm sure it must have been fun to party with Henry VIII at the beginning of his reign. He was, he was young, he was funny. At Arthur and Catherine's wedding, he took off his jacket and danced and this and that and the other. And then I think he's fascinated because he meets people like Erasmus of Rotterdam, where he's still a child, and Catherine of Aragon. He's fascinated by Europe too, by the continent.
Yeah.
And he goes to the continent. I mean, for an English king, he goes a lot to the continent. He's like, every other day, he's like, I think we should have a diplomatic meeting in France. Which is a bit telling of his power. If he was so powerful, the French king was never in England, really.
Right.
Right. Charles V went to visit him went to visit his aunt. The description of how Charles V arrives, for example, and there's a whole ceremonial, and the last part is his aunt waiting him in the staircase. And he goes and kneels in front of the Queen of England, the most powerful man in the world, goes to England, does this whole thing, greets Henry, goes through all these things. Everybody's so excited, and then goes up some stairs and kneels in front of the Queen of England. And she's like, Come on, Race, you're fine. Imagine having that woman do all those things for you, bring the emperor to your kingdom,
Right.
call you uncle,
Yeah,
right?
she is so underrated, isn't she?
I know.
We're trying.
We're trying really hard.
We're trying.
It's taking me 15 years of my life to like start having people listen to this.
Yes. Well, her story is fascinating.
It is.
And we talked about Francis the First in France and Sir Henry Guildford. And I'm
Mm.
curious because we've touched base before on the Field of Cloth of Gold.
Yes,
Is there a
yes.
connection to Sir Henry Guildford there as well?
There's many because he's in charge of all these things that, I mean, the Field of Cloth of Gold was a big revel, really, a big party.
Yeah.
That's what it was. So everyone in the Tudor court that was someone in that sense was involved, obviously, and vice versa. And so Henry Guildford and Francis the First have a deep connection, and I want to talk about this because it's telling of the strategy that Henry VIII and Francis and other people used to neutralize Catherine of Aragon's power. When so because Sir Henry Guildford is someone that is so strongly connected to the Spanish alliance, eventually when Francis wants to win him over, he grants him a pension. And this is something that, you can't just not accept a pension from the King of France. Right. So I've noticed this with many other people that are, or for example, with the Horn Boots, that when they reappear in the royal accounts, it's because Henry VIII has probably appropriated them from the service of Catherine of Aragon, because they're not in the accounts until 1529. So what I'm saying is that kings are very powerful, and even Sir Henry Guildford, or think about Thomas More, or think about all those people that, had to make the king happy, but also had their strong opinions about the things that were happening in the court. That was bravery, because Sir Henry Guildford, and like Thomas More, is one of those guys who is like, okay, he accepts a pension from France. He has to, because he's been involved in something that we can talk about that is very cool, but he has to accept this. But then as soon as he can, he just makes it clear that he's not happy with what's happening in front of Henry, and actually has, like we've said, has an encounter with Anne Boleyn that tells him, and I looked this up to see exactly what she told him. She told him that she would, when she would be queen, he wouldn't be the controller anymore. She would make sure of that. And this is when he said, "There's no need for that. I'm leaving." And he goes to Henry, and Henry is like, "You shouldn't listen to women," because Henry.
Yeah, the tool.
The tool. The tool says that he insists that he takes back his office, and so Henry Guildford's like, "No, I'm good, thanks. I'm just going to Leeds Castle and just, So this is how you can see that the change is starting, and it's not a good change. When people just leave like that, people that have been next to you all your life, that you've gotten along with, that was probably not just the only incident. That was probably an accumulation of things that Sir Henry Guildford was like, "I can't take it anymore because I'm going to get into trouble eventually. I'm going to say either something to Henry, and I'm going to lose my head,"
Right.
Right.
Yeah, because all of his friends, his closest friends, started moving away from him once he started pushing for Anne Boleyn.
Yes, and Sir Henry Guildford is the best example, probably, how his enormous career in the Tudor court ends so abruptly. I'm sure it wasn't only that incident. It's a situation of bubbling up and realizing that it's going to get out of control. I think they could see where it was heading, a lot of them.
Right. And especially, I would think him being such a traveler, having been all over the place, he had seen all kinds of things Sir Henry Guildford had. And so he probably saw some of the writing on the wall, or had read enough history to know that Henry VIII was going in the wrong direction.
Well, and think about their personal interest. This guy has a pomegranate in his coat of arms that he's earned in Spain. So this taking over, the French alliance taking over, is a serious matter for him. It's a serious matter for his interests in the Tudor court, for what he's fought all his life. I mean, if you go all the way to Spain to risk your life for fame and fortune and you get it, and the Spanish king knights you, and that's a bond that stays forever. And and then you've worked with these people from Spain to bring people like Torrellano, to bring people like Holbein, to not only the people in Spain, but this network that this Queen consort has enabled you, has helped you to do your work in the best way. And then you've been in the forefront of the revolution, of the introduction of Renaissance, really, in the Tudor court. So I think he was probably a very proud person too, because those are kind of the things that you get later in life when you've achieved a lot. It's like, woman, do you not know what I've done? Like, what are you talking about? This is not something you can just take away from me. One of those instances where probably Anne Boleyn was sorry about saying that later on, because it wasn't a very fortunate thing to say in front of everyone. Maybe in private, it would have been better, you know? Be careful, because, no.
When did Henry Guildford die?
He died shortly after, a couple of years. So they're all also, people are aging in the court of Henry VIII through the first generation of people. And 2 years after that he leaves court, he dies in Leeds Castle.
Oh, so he didn't see the downfall of Anne Boleyn.
No, he dies in 1532, I think. He doesn't see the worst. 1532, he dies.
Oh, okay.
So there's some stuff that he's seen. He doesn't get to see, the very bad years. And I'm talking about the people in what I called in my dissertation, the Court of Defense of Catherine of Aragon. That side, from 1532 to the death of Catherine of Aragon, oh my goodness, it's bad.
So I wonder, I'm trying to remember the time frame here. Would he have known about the death of Sir Thomas More? Because that would have been, right, 1532, I believe.
I think it's about the time.
Yeah, and Bishop Fisher, all of that.
Yep, I think this is, yep.
And he's sitting at Leeds Castle, probably hearing all of these terrible things.
Well, More was 35.
Oh, it was that late.
Yep.
I'm a little bit off there.
I think and the reason why I think More is later, because he stays for a year in the Tower of London. And it is really when Henry marries Anne and she's crowned in 1533. That's really when everyone starts to be persecuted.
Right.
First they're bullied, and then they're persecuted legally.
Yeah. Okay.
This is the time, 1529, when he had a Blackfriars trial. But then, for example, Juan Luis Vives is placed on house arrest, and then he flees. And so people are leaving. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. I guess my timeline was a little bit off there, but I'm glad you clarified that, because
it's difficult for me sometimes too, because there's a lot of things that happen very quickly, and a lot of people die.
Yeah.
A lot of people leave. It's difficult to keep track of all of this, but especially, and the last, we have to think about, for example, the dissolution of the houses of Catherine of Aragon and Mary Tudor. That's around the time they said Henry Guildford dies. Okay. So there's different stages of their downfall too. At first is a legal battle, and it's not really known if Catherine might win, and she does win in Rome.
Right.
And for the rest of the monarchs, like, for example, not for Francis, who wants to have Henry on his side, but for Charles V, she's always a Queen of England until she dies.
Right.
And his cousin is always a princess of England. She'll always be, Mary Tudor would always be, to him, the lawful and legitimate child. I mean, for Charles V, this was a great insult. Think about it.
Yeah.
All the Italian states were in favor of Catherine of Aragon. All the women in the Catholic world were in favor of Catherine of Aragon, because the idea that a man could divorce you meant he could leave you without nothing.
Yes.
Marriage was a protection. Really. And then it was It's something. It's at the base, really, of the Catholic faith, right? Marriage and family, really.
Yeah, till death do us part, right?
Exactly. And then how can you, for example, we've talked about Henry Guildford losing it with Anne Boleyn because he gets all, oh, well, I'll leave and whatever. But the pressure is so high and the stakes are so high at this point that even Catherine of Aragon loses it sometimes. And when they come and tell her again, the king knows that you've never been married and this and that, she gets really upset and she says some more, and she first curses Henry in Latin. Yikes. He says something along the lines of shame on the man who casts away his wife.
Oh.
So, but it's in Latin, so it sounds very like, whoa, okay. And then she just goes on a rant saying that she cannot accept having been a harlot for 24 years.
Fair.
And that's what I don't think people who say she should have accepted that the marriage had ended. No marriage ended in the Middle Ages or the modern era. No marriage ended. It had to be annulled, which meant that, and then Henry and her, I mean, he wasn't saying Mary wasn't his. He was saying Mary was illegitimate.
Right.
He never doubted that Catherine of Aragon was faithful to him. He just doubted that the marriage had ever happened. I mean, come on. How can you accept that? How can Sir Henry Guildford, who admires you, accept that? How can Thomas More, who you've raised your daughters with, like, you know, the daughters of Thomas More and Mary Tudor were close, they were being educated the same way. All these things, how can you accept that? You can't accept that. For a Catholic queen to accept that she had been, and she says harlot, I think she says prostitute later, she's very upset because the king is insulting her honor, her honesty in a public sphere, in a European public sphere.
Yeah. I think anybody would feel that way, but especially I feel like the daughter of Isabella would feel that way.
The youngest daughter, so the one that got the most time with her mother, the one that was the most similar to her. And also just the pressure of, you have to be the most decent woman on this earth because you are my daughter and because God, that is, chastity was everything to the women in the Spanish monarchy. Everything. That's why you don't get accounts of them. Oh, she slept with so and so. Oh, you don't get those accounts with the women in the Spanish monarchy. You don't. Try to find one. You get other accounts like there were two prudes. You know, that's what you get a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're just prudes. No, it's a mission to keep legitimacy intact. The women give the legitimacy, not the men. Really, if you think about it, it's the women.
I love how we always just end up talking about Katherine of Aragon.
Me too.
It's inevitable.
But she was, I mean, the topic is about her, really, because she has a partnership with Sir Henry Guildford, right? And he is one of the leaders of the Court of Defense. He's seen this revolution that she's enabled and these international relations that she's enabled, and he likes her, so he is defending her. So, and for example, it's just, to me it's so obvious, but this has not been written about a lot. For example, when Holbein arrives to England, he arrives with letters of recommendation by Erasmus of Rotterdam. We know he goes and works with Thomas More and all those things. We talked about that book that I already mentioned, where there's a frontispiece by Holbein, is a book on matrimony written by Erasmus of Rotterdam, dedicated to Catherine of Aragon in 1526, referencing the work of a painter. So this happens in 1526. Holbein arrives, blah, blah, and he works at the first job he does for anyone in the royal court is for Henry Guildford. He entrusts him to paint a view of Therouanne. Therouanne, the city that Henry had captured in 1513 with Maximilian the Emperor.
Right.
And Holbein paints this view of Therouanne that's taken by boat from somewhere in London, I believe from Queenhithe, because it was probably painted in a painting workshop that Catherine of Aragon had in Baynard's Castle in Blackfriars. And that was taken up to Greenwich, where it was in full display when the French ambassadors that were going to bring the marriage offer of Francis I to marry Mary Tudor. So Catherine of Aragon's biggest enemy to marry his own daughter. Her own daughter. Yeah. So this view of Therouanne is in full display when the French ambassadors. Isn't that weird? If you're trying to make French to paint the city that you captured some time ago, and then when Henry's in the banquet, there's an account that says, and he told him, "Look, have you seen what we painted for you?"
It's so ridiculous.
If that's not screaming, you can go back to France where you belong.
Right. It's like diplomacy at its finest.
Well, and then in those accounts where Holbein writes down what he uses, a lot of the colors are called Spanish brown, Spanish white. And a lot of the artists that are linked to the Spanish, a couple of artists that I'm studying that are linked to the Spanish monarchy are working in that project too. So I think this is the last time that Sir Henry Guildford and Katherine of Aragon try to neutralize the French alliance by trying to slap the ambassadors in the face, basically, with this painting of Therouanne, if you think about it.
Remember when we did this, guys?
Yeah. Remember, just a reminder, right?
Yeah, know your place.
And I'm sure that, Sir Henry Guildford, who had worked with many of the artists that came because of the Spanish alliance, told Holbein, make it look really Spanish. No, it's all these little crumbs. I call them sparks in my dissertation. You grab the sparks of all these things and you put them together and you have a story. And Sir Henry Guildford was definitely a Spanish alliance guy. And that's why I think he's not as known, because the Spanish alliance is not as known, and because he's part of that first part of the reign of Henry VIII that we don't know so much about.
Right. And that Holbein painting of him is you get the impression of his importance at the Tudor court when you look at it.
And you get the impression that he's just going to start saying something and talking to you, right? Yeah. It's such a good portrait. The sketch is also, so we're lucky not always when we have Holbein portraits, we have the sketches, but we do have the sketch for that one. We have a painting of his wife. And she is dressed in very similar attire to one of the harem boot miniatures of Catherine of Aragon that was copied by Holland in the 17th century. So I think, yes, fashion, looking like Catherine of Aragon in her painting of Holbein, this was painted at the same time of Sir Henry Guildford, the first time that Holbein arrives to England. This is telling us that they're part of the Court of Defense of Catherine of Aragon. Wow. Because we know there's connections between Holbein and the Horror Boots too.
Every time you come on the show, it is so enlightening. And I'm so glad we got to talk about Sir Henry Guildford, the fun guy today, and his connection to Katherine of Aragon and Spain and his friendship with Henry VIII, because, as I've said before, we don't hear about him enough. His name.
He needs a good study. He needs a good study as a patron of the arts, and he needs a good biography. If anybody knows of a good study or biography, I have delved into his figure, not as much as obviously Catherine of Aragon, but if anyone knows of a good study of him or things, I'm still studying about him. So I'm still learning about him. I want to know more about this guy. I know there was an inventory of the goods of Leeds Castle when he died. That's a very interesting place, because he has things like tapestries of unicorns. Ooh. So anything with unicorns is down my lane too. And then overall, there just needs to be a study of him as a person who introduced Renaissance to England and who favored the international relations of England, really.
Yeah, he was an important figure.
Very important. He needs more press, and he needs more work to be done on him. So.
Yes, most definitely. So, Dr. Emma, what is your takeaway for today?
We needed to start thinking about a party, right? Because maybe in this tour that we're going to do of Catherine of Aragon and the Tudor court, maybe we could think of a good party to a theme party. Maybe we dress up as women in the Spanish monarchy or something like that.
There we go. Let's keep it interesting and have some fun like Sir Henry Guildford knew how to do.
Oh, yeah. He did have some. I would like to party with Sir Henry Guildford and ask him so many questions. I would keep pouring him some ale or wine or whatever he liked drinking and say, hey, tell me more about Torrellano. Because, for example, Torrellano, this is how relevant these people are. Maybe I'm going over time, but this is the last one, I promise. This is how relevant Sir Henry Guildford and Catherine of Aragon are in artistic innovation in England. Pietro Torrellano learned to his art with Michelangelo. They were both together learning at the in a place that the Medici had to let artists learn about art. How wonderful is that, right?
Right.
And Torrellano and Michelangelo were working together there, and they were working on a project one day, and Michelangelo looks over and looks at Torrellano's work, and they're always it's a thing called in Italian paragone, which is like competition always between the arts. Is sculpture representing real life better? Is paintings represent? That's called paragone. And they were, always like having these fights to see who was the best to represent real life, right? And Michelangelo looks over to Torrellano what he's doing, and he makes a comment. If something happens, he makes a comment. Something he says is not that, and Torrellano breaks Michelangelo's nose.
No.
He punches him in the face and breaks his nose.
That's such a great story.
And then, because everybody adores Michelangelo, he's called Il Divino Michelangelo. He's like, everybody knows he's a genius. The Medici are like, Torrellano, you have to leave now. Go away. What did you do, man? You can't break Michelangelo's nose. That's when he goes to Rome, and that's when he works for Spanish patrons. Then he goes to the court of Margaret of Austria to work on a sculpture of Mary Rose Tudor, who was betrothed to Charles V, nephew of Catherine of Aragon. And that's how he ends up in the Tudor court, creating pomegranate molds with Sir Henry Guildford for the Epiphany when Henry, Duke of Cornwall, was born. Margaret of Austria we've talked about this, was his godmother. So this is how Torrellano arrives to, after breaking Michelangelo's nose, he gets a second chance in London with Catherine of Aragon.
I love it when you come on the show because we always get these great anecdotes from you that maybe we don't hear about very often.
Who would have thought we were going to end up talking about two guys having a fight? Right. Two of the most amazing artists of the Renaissance, really. And then Torrellano ends up in Spain, painting Isabella of Portugal, and dying in prison because he wasn't a good guy. He got into fights a lot. Maybe we could talk about Torrellano in another.
I was just going to say, there's a whole another topic for us to touch base
Torrellano.
on.
He has a life very similar to Caravaggio. They're just like these artists that are also like, a bit of trouble. Imagine Torrellano partying with Sir Henry Guildford. That would have been fun to see. Do you think he broke any more noses in the Tudor court? Maybe he did.
Probably. It sounds like maybe he had a little bit of a temper.
Well, he ended up in prison because he created a sculpture of the Virgin Mary for a duke, and the duke was like, I'm not sure, and he goes and destroys it, and that's so illegal in Spain at the time. He ends up grabbed by the Inquisition. You can't destroy the statue of the Virgin Mary. That's sacrilege. Wow. So he ends up dying in prison.
Interesting. See, always interesting story. Dr. Emma, thank you again for coming on today. I look forward to the next time we get to chat.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing me. Have a great day, guys.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.